is part one of my watercolor demo. In this part, we're going to talk about a little bit of the setup that you need in order to paint with watercolor, as well as how to prepare your paint, how to load your brush, and some of the very basic techniques that you're going to use when creating your painting. So I have my setup here. If you notice, I have my watercolor brush, I have my water, I have my palette and my paint. My paints they're tube watercolors, but they've already kind of been dried. So we'll go over how to kind of recharge them and re-wet them and get them ready to paint, as well as the most important thing is having a paper towel or something in order to dry your brush or mop up any extra water that you aren't going to need. Okay? All right, so starting with preparing your paint. So all of my paint is dried out. So in order to kind of get it ready to begin painting, I'm going to just take some water, straight water with my brush, and add it to the well. I'll try and add a whole bunch first. And then just dissolve that dried paint within the water. And the more intense the color, obviously, the more paint that is dissolved within that water. So that water is super saturated with paint. All right. So when you begin to paint, one of the most common kind of mistakes that people do when they're beginning watercolor painting is that you don't put enough paint or enough water on your brush. You want to make sure that that brush is super saturated with that kind of watery paint. Okay, and then that paint will just flow off that brush very smoothly. And if you notice, when you're painting, you want to have a really light touch. You don't want to press really hard. You don't want to bring your brush back and forth and drag it across the surface of that paper, because watercolor paper gets very wet, the surface gets super saturated, and it can kind of very easily like pill and start to tear away. Okay, so you want to have a very, very light touch when you're painting with watercolor. Okay? All right, so some of the techniques that we're going to learn, the first one is called, very simply, wet on wet. And that is when you have a wet surface and then you're adding wet paint to the wet surface. So there's a couple different ways to do this. You can start with just taking clean water and adding, and just essentially just wetting the paper first, adding water to the surface of the paper, and then adding your paint on top of that. And if you notice, what it does is it starts to bleed. It starts to kind of expand, and it does its watercolor thing. And you can use this to blend colors, so you can add a couple more colors, and then they'll start to kind of blend on its own. So that's called wet on wet. Now you can do the same thing if you have an underlying color, and then add a different color on top of that. And again, it's going to bleed. You kind of can't really control where it's going to bleed, but that's okay. A lot about watercolor is just accepting what happens and rolling with it. Okay, so that is what we call wet on wet technique. Now, the second one is called wet on dry, which, if you haven't figured that out, means that the paper is dry, and then we add the wet paint to the dry paper. Okay, and if you notice, what happens is that it does not bleed. It'll stay where you put it. So if you want to have a very precise shape or an area that has very precise borders, then you make sure that the paper underneath it is dry before you start to paint. Okay, so the next thing is layering. So when you're layering color, if you do not want it to look like this, where we have a lot of bleeding happening with our like a wet on wet technique, you need to make sure that that under layer is completely dry before you paint on top of it. So this blue right here, this little blue section, is completely dry. So if I wanted to make purple, I would put a fairly transparent layer of red on top of my blue. So instead of, it's another way of making purple, instead of just mixing it outright, I can add a layer of red on top of the layer of blue, and that will change the color of my blue to purple. Okay, but again, you really need to make sure that that layer, under layer, is completely dry before you go on top of it. If it isn't, not only will the colors mix, they will also, you end up super saturating your paper, and that will start to tear the paper. And so we can use this wet on wet technique to help create some gradients. So with watercolor, obviously water is our friend, and it will help us create a nice gradient from light to dark. So I can start with a fairly saturated area of blue, then I can rinse out my brush, add just water, and use that water to fade that blue out to nothing. And so I'm just pulling the paint from the saturated area to a fairly unsaturated area. I can kind of help it along if I needed to kind of be a little bit more of a gradient, because everything was pooled over here and there was nothing over here, and I want to have like a nice midtone. There. Okay. Now, sometimes when you're painting, you accidentally put a color where you don't want it to go. Maybe you're using wet on wet. It bleeds somewhere where you don't want it to go. You actually, watercolor is fairly forgiving in that way, that you can essentially erase the color that you don't want. Let's say I really don't want this little blob of green. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take clean water. I'm going to add a whole bunch of water to it. And using my brush, I'm kind of like very gently rub the surface. And then I'm going to take my paper towel and I'm going to soak up that area of water, and then boom, it's gone. And so as long as that particular area of green was not dry yet, and so as long as it's not dry, completely dry, it's very easy to take up and very easy to erase. If it's completely dry, you can lighten up areas, but you might not be able to completely erase it. And the thing to remember before we kind of begin our painting, that with watercolor, less is more. If I want to have really light blue, for example, this area here of my gradient, I'm not mixing white with the blue. I am just using a lot less paint, a lot more water, and keeping things very transparent. So anywhere where you want white in your painting, you're not going to paint it white. You're actually just going to leave the area of the paper white. You're just not going to paint there. Okay? All right, so now that you have some basics, let's get started on our painting.